Hi there. I spent 8 years as the first evangelist at Datadog, the leader in observability. It changed my life, being part of a tiny 30-person startup and be there for the IPO and growing to thousands of folks. But it's been a while since I played with all of the features, and it turns out they fit in perfectly with a new feature in n8n. You've got workflows running everywhere, but when something breaks or slows down, you're stuck clicking through individual executions trying to guess what happened. n8n now speaks OpenTelemetry, which means you can pipe every workflow trace straight into Datadog and see exactly where your bottlenecks hide. It's literally 2 environment variables or GUI settings to get started. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how to wire it up and what the traces look like once they land in your dashboard. Now, I'm using Datadog because it's what I'm most familiar with. Since then, lots of alternatives have popped up. And if you have simpler requirements, there are plenty of solutions you can use instead of Datadog. As long as they support OpenTelemetry, then you should be able to use them instead. But Datadog's pretty awesome, and you should give them a shot too. Quick pause. This video is sponsored by n8n. And that made this one pretty easy because n8n is the whole reason we can even do this demo in the first place. If you're building automations and AI workflows and want something you can actually inspect, debug, and run like a real system, n8n gives you a ton of control without making you fight the tool. I've used a lot of automation products that look nice right up until you need to figure out why one step is slow, why one API call keeps failing. And then the whole thing turns into a scavenger hunt. So thanks to n8n for sponsoring the channel and shipping OpenTelemetry support, because this is exactly the kind of feature that makes workflows way less opaque once they leave the canvas. Now, if you've been using n8n for a while, you know the built-in execution log works fine when you have a handful of workflows. But here's where that falls apart. Once you scale to dozens of workflows running every hour, that execution log becomes a needle-in-a-haystack. You can't see patterns. You can't tell if one node has been getting slower over the past week. You're essentially flying blind at scale. Now, before version 2.22, n8n included solid internal observability. You could see what happened inside an individual execution, but the moment you needed to integrate that data with a wider distributed tracing setup, you were out of luck. Outbound calls to external services were completely opaque. If a workflow hung, you couldn't tell whether it was n8n itself, the network, or the third-party service on the other end. So here's what changed. OpenTelemetry support is now built right into n8n. It's the industry standard for collecting traces, metrics, and logs from distributed systems. Think of a trace like a GPS tracker that you slap onto a package. It follows a single request end-to-end through every service and operation it touches. A trace gives you a visual map that helps you pinpoint latency, catch hidden errors, and spot anomalies across your entire stack. Now, in n8n terms, each workflow execution becomes one trace. The workflow itself is the root span, and every node inside it appears as a child span. That means you get a waterfall chart showing exactly what happened, how long each step took, and where the errors occurred. n8n sends these using OTLP over HTTP with protobuf encoding, the standard protocol that virtually every backend accepts natively. Here's where it gets even more useful. Because n8n uses the W3C trace context propagation standard, it can link with upstream and downstream services. If a request comes in from another service that already has a trace ID, n8n catches it and continues the chain. When n8n makes an outbound request, it passes that trace ID along in the HTTP headers. Your n8n workflows aren't isolated anymore. They become first-class citizens in your existing observability stack. Now, here's the part you've been waiting for. Let's set it up in the n8n UI, because that's really the fastest way to see if this works. Go to Settings, then OpenTelemetry. Turn it on. and paste in your Datadog OTLP endpoint. It'll look something like otlp.datadoghq.com, depending on your region, I think. But watch for one easy gotcha. The Datadog URL you copy may end with /v1/trace, and you want to remove that part so that you're left with just the base URL. Then add the headers. You need your Datadog API key in a header, and you also want to set a source header. I wanted to set this to something arbitrary, but it seemed to not work unless I set it to LLM OBS. I don't know why. After that, you can play with the other settings, but that's enough to get traces flowing. If you prefer to manage this in code for production, you can do the same thing with environment variables, but I treat that as an advanced path and check the n8n docs for the exact variable names and header format. Now, before you roll this out, use the Send Test Trace button that n8n provides. It fires a single test span to your collector and confirms that Datadog is receiving the data. Don't skip this step. There's nothing worse than enabling tracing, running 50 workflows, and then realizing you'd set the wrong endpoint and have no data to show for it. One more thing you need to think about is sampling. If you're running thousands of executions per day, you probably don't want to send every single trace to Datadog. That gets expensive fast. n8n gives you a configurable sampling rate, so you can send a percentage of traces. I wish you could set this per workflow, but for now it seems to be a global setting. You can toggle node spans on or off depending on whether you need granular visibility into every single node or just the high-level workflow data. Once traces hit Datadog, here's what you see. Each workflow execution shows up as its own trace, and the workflow name is in there as well. I went ahead and clicked on the name to add it as a column. Underneath that parent span, every node in your workflow generates a child span in the order it executed. Instead of guessing which node is your bottleneck, you just look at the waterfall and find the longest bar. If your HTTP request node is taking 800 milliseconds while everything else finishes in 50, you know where to optimize. If your code node is throwing errors every third execution, the trace shows you the pattern without you having to dig through logs manually. Search and filter traces by workflow name, execution status, or time range. Custom telemetry tags is in there too, and they look super cool, but unfortunately this seems to be the one piece that is restricted to an enterprise license for n8n. You can also push n8n metrics into Datadog, and that's useful if you want trend charts, alerts, and long-term views of workflow health. But that's a different setup, and for this video, I wanted to stay focused on OpenTelemetry traces so you can get this working fast. If you want a separate video on sending n8n metrics to Datadog, let me know in the comments and I'll make that next. Without observability, you're always reacting to problems after they blow something up. With n8n and OpenTelemetry wired into Datadog or other tools, you see bottlenecks before they become outages. You know which node to optimize. You get alerts when error rates climb, and you can prove to yourself or to your team that your automations are running reliably. Teams use this setup for capacity planning, meeting reliability targets, and optimizing external dependencies. When you can see the third-party API has been getting slower for 2 weeks straight, you can switch to a backup provider or add caching before your users notice a delay. So that's the gap between guessing what's wrong with your workflows and knowing exactly which node is the bottleneck. You only need 2 environment variables and a Datadog account, and every execution becomes a trace you can read. I think this is wickedly cool, and I'm excited to see how this changes the way you think about observability with n8n. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.